This video will introduce the book of Amos. Amos, a herdsman called to be a prophet. Amos, the man. Amos was from Tekoa in Judah. Though he was not a professional prophet, in chapter 1 and verse 1 and chapter 7 and verse 14, he indicates that he actually earned his living from being a herdsman and a grower of sycamore figs rather than earning his keep by his prophetic ministry. Tekoa, you can see on the map, ancient Tekoa was there. This is modern Tekoa. You can see from Herodium, big fortress that Herod the Great built. The occasion of this prophecy is around 760 BC. First half of the 8th century is what I like to call the Silver Age under Uzziah of Judah, who reigned from 792 to 740 BC, and Jeroboam II of Israel, who reigned from 793 to 753. It says in verse 1 that the prophecy begins 2 years before the earthquake, which would be really helpful if we had any clue what earthquake is being referred to. However, the historical books do not record any such earthquake around the 8th century BC, and so that doesn't help us date the book more precisely. But the book is clearly an 8th century prophet, and there are others. Isaiah, as we've already seen, is 8th century. Hosea is an 8th century prophet. So is Amos and Micah and Jonah. Amos prophesies during what I like to call the Silver Age. The Silver Age was a time of great economic growth and prosperity under Jeroboam II of Israel, but it was also a time of social injustice, and Amos is going to point out that there was great exploitation of socially vulnerable groups like widows and orphans and sojourners and the like. Now, the contemporary Hosea emphasized another sin, namely idolatry. Amos, who's a contemporary also of the northern kingdom, condemns Israel for social injustice. And those are kind of two sides of the coin of the sinfulness of the northern kingdom during these days. The outline of the book is as follows. It begins with oracles against the nations, Amos chapter 1 and 2. But then it has judgment against Israel in chapters 3 through 6. And then it ends with a series of 5 prophetic visions in Amos 7 through 9. The oracles against nations shows that God holds even Gentiles accountable for their transgressions. And it goes through different countries one by one. It starts with Syria, and it condemns Syria for their military barbarism against Israel. They thresh Gilead with instruments of iron. Then it condemns the Philistines, especially for their slave trade. And it's interesting that slave trading is condemned in this particular case. They deported an entire population to deliver it up to Edom. Those that say that the Bible condones slavery need to read this passage. And then there's a condemnation of Tyre, also involved in the slave trade and breaking promises. They delivered up an entire population to Edom, and they did not remember the covenant of brotherhood. And this would be a treaty probably with Israel, where they said we would be brothers with each other, but then they violated that treaty. Edom is also condemned for lack of brotherly love against its brother nation, Israel. Again, Edom are the descendants of Esau, the twin brother of Jacob, from whom Israel is derived. Edom pursued his brother with the sword. Ammon is condemned for savage cruelty in war against Israel. They ripped open pregnant women of Gilead. Moab is condemned for its vengeful spirit. They not only killed their enemy, the king of Edom, but they burned the bones of the king of Edom, probably their way of destroying his happiness in the afterlife. But then it moves much closer to home. This is all countries round about Israel, but now it moves towards Israel itself. By the way, all these prophecies were fulfilled by Tiglath-Pileser III primarily, who invaded all these countries. And further invasions occurred under Shalmaneser V and Sargon II. And so within the lifetime of some of the hearers of Amos's prophecy, all these things came about. But then the oracle turns on Israel and Judah. They condemned Judah because they rejected the law of the Lord. Now it's interesting, the other nations are not condemned for rejecting God's law. They didn't have God's law. They were condemned for rejecting what common morality would have accepted to be morally wrong. I mean, who doesn't believe that ripping open pregnant women isn't morally wrong? Even a pagan knows that. But Judah is condemned by the law. They rejected the law of the Lord. But then it focuses especially on Israel. And many sins are listed. There are unjust judges who would basically change their decision based on bribes. In fact, you could bribe them for as cheap as a pair of sandals. You have oppression of the poor in chapter 2 and verse 7. You have sexual immorality in chapter 2 and verse 7. Here's some of the verses condemning those who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth. A man and his father go into the same girl, so that my holy name is profane. That's sexual immorality, either a same slave girl or a same prostitute. They lay themselves beside every altar on garments taken in pledge, and in the house of their God they drink wine of those who have been fined. And yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them. And so besides sexual immorality, you have lack of mercy, where they're taking things seized as pledge and not giving it back as the law demands if it's a cold night. And they're hypocritical in their worship. They do these evil things and then they go and worship the Lord. They were also opposed to those who obeyed God's word and those that proclaimed God's word. So you have a description of, I raised up some of your sons for prophets and some of your young men for Nazarites. But you made the Nazarites drink wine and commanded the prophets, saying, you shall not prophesy. They didn't want to hear God's word. So they opposed obedience to God's word, like the Nazarite opposed proclamation of God's words by the prophets. And in general, Amos teaches us about justice, social justice. Amos taught that a proper relationship with God should result in social justice. Of course, what about today? How should the gospel affect our view of feeding the poor, of sheltering the homeless, of civil rights, of giving decent wages? God's law emphasizes concern for widows, orphans, and foreigners. New Testament commends famine relief. James says that we need to help those in need. So social justice is a natural outgrowth of biblical teaching in general. But then this judgment against Israel gets elaborated in chapters 3 through 6, but I think I'll stop here and continue on the next video.